Okay, everybody, thanks for being here. Two really interesting films. As I said, my name is Jonathan Whitmer-Rich. I'm a professor at Cleveland Marshall College of Law, Cleveland State University. I teach criminal law and criminal procedure. So I'm happy to just kind of open it up and ask if folks have comments about the films, thoughts, questions. We can just have kind of an open discussion here. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. You know, criminal law, which I teach, is so compelling because the stories are they're so compelling, right? On both the victim side and on the offender's side, there's just a tremendous amount at stake on both sides. It's really
Ohio Humanities welcomes you to the Chagrin Documentary Film Festival. For 50 years, Ohio Humanities has had a rich history of supporting documentary film projects that spark conversations, inspire ideas, and share Ohio's stories. We are so excited to continue this tradition as the presenting.
Where
yeah.
else are these films located? Like, where else are these films being shown? Any other festivals or anything like that?
I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that, but that's something we could certainly look up, or you might be able to even go. A lot of those have their own websites and places that you can access information. I'm not sure about that.
Comment in the back there?
Yeah, I'm interested in the School of Law and with works that are taught. The first film is that you know how she brought up the whole business behind prisons
Yeah,
and mass incarceration.
right.
Is that something that would be discussed in classes and what to do about it? And as a lawyer, you know, how can you make a change? What can be done? I mean, is it, are you talking about that in law school?
We definitely are. Yes, she talked about Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. That was a really transformational book, and um, I mean, she says correctly. You know, a couple decades ago, when I went to law school, for example, the the phrase mass incarceration, we didn't really hear that phrase. It was happening in the United States, but we didn't hear it. And you know, Michelle Alexander, a lot of other people, right, leaders who kind of helped us recognize, wow, this is a massive social phenomenon that's happening. Why is this happening in a free country where we have this incredibly, you know, punitive response to crime and what's going on there. So yes, that's definitely a big focus of what we talk about now in law schools. Um, you know, a big challenge for law schools, we're training students to be lawyers, defense lawyers, prosecutors. Um, and in many cases, our students feel, you know, once you take a job in the public defender's office, you're representing people, you're inside the system. You can't transform the system as one lawyer representing one client, right? You just kind of, they offer your client a plea deal. It's probably better what they get at trial, and you know the system grinds along. It has an overwhelming focus on the value of efficiency, like the most cases getting through as quickly as possible. That's the overwhelming focus of the system, and so it's very difficult. But we definitely try to have those conversations, like how do we you know, I taught a course that was just focused on that. Like, what are there, you know, what would ways be to change the dynamics of what's happening here? And there are things happening in Cuyahoga County in the state of Ohio, but it's kind of two steps forward, one, two, or three steps back sometimes. But yeah, we are definitely talking about that in law schools these days, for sure. Yeah.
And what is the answer here? Is the the labor, the money, the capitalism, the food service companies that feed all of the prisoners. I mean, it seems so apparent, and of course, Brian Stevenson, people know who he is. I think they made a film, Conspiracy,
Yeah, correct.
you know, with Brian Stevenson. I mean, how do you stop it? Now, how much of our economy is dependent? We
So I'm gonna push back on that premise, because while mass incarceration is absolutely a massive thing in the United States, it's a choice we're making. And there are instances where there's profit being made, different things like that. The idea that this is a profit center for the United States is definitely wrong. It's extremely expensive for state and local governments and for the federal government. Um, so, um, so for example, prisonpolicy.org is an excellent organization that gathers statistics about our prison population, our jail populations, and so forth. And they had some statistics showing that in federal prison, for example, where you have about, I think, 600,000 or 700,000 prisoners, the number of them who are employed by private corporations is about 5,000, a tiny number. In state prisons, it's a little bit higher, but of state prisoners, about 1.9 million prisoners, there are about 6% of them are employed by private companies. So that's a thing. It happens a little bit, but it's not a huge phenomenon, and it's not a huge driver, in my view, of mass incarceration. Also, the prisons themselves, of course, employ many more people than that. I was talking about external employment with private corporations. They employ their own prisoners to run their own prison, and that's absolutely the case. And they pay them a pittance, right? Like a couple dollars a day often. But it still does not make those prisons a profitable enterprise. They are wildly expensive. They're a huge drain on state and local and federal budgets. So I think the story that the reason we run mass incarceration is because we're making a lot of money off of it, I just don't think is supported by the data. We're running it because we're making a policy choice based on kind of fear and lack of other thinking about how you can respond to criminal conduct that's wildly different than the choices that most other countries in the world make, right? They don't respond that same way, and that we used to make. I mean, the incarceration rate, 60, 70, 80 years ago in the United States was vastly lower than it is today. And so it's really a policy choice that we're making, and it's costing us money, certainly as taxpayers, and it's costing us a lot more in terms of just how our society is. What's that?
The reason for the mass incarceration is because of the lack of mental health facilities.
So there is some, that's an interesting phenomenon. It was the case. So I talked about how, 60, 70 years ago, there was vastly less incarceration. There was way more mental health involuntary commitment of people. And there is an interesting phenomenon where you see, if you look over time, right, the population of involuntarily civilly committed mental health population is pretty high in the United States, and that goes down dramatically. We just shut down those facilities at about the same time that we started ramping up incarceration. So those phenomena are really interesting, and they kind of do happen at the same time. One counter narrative to that is that it's not the same demographic population. So mental health facilities had a lot of middle-aged women in them, for example, whereas our prisons do not. They were not, our mental health facilities, 60 years ago were not primarily housing young black men. Our prisons are. So it is, I think there is kind of an interesting and complicated connection there, and the need for mental health services in these populations is acute, absolutely. So, yeah, it's a good comment. Yeah.
How much will you think the national decriminalization of possession affect the inequities of incarceration?
Are you talking about just like the marijuana announcement that was just made, or drugs more generally, or?
Marijuana, other things with possession.
So drug possession is not a large driver of mass incarceration. Most of the people, so we can think of jails are facilities that are like short-term housing of people, and prisons long-term housing of people. Almost no one in a prison, or very few people in a prison, are there for possession of drugs. They're there for trafficking in drugs, the sale. So I think that the criminalization of drug possession is important and problematic, and it leads to future problems. People start having interactions with the criminal justice system, and they start accumulating prior arrests, and those can lead to bigger punishments in the future. But for example, President Biden talked about a mass pardon recently of all federal convictions for marijuana possession, and there are 0 people in federal prison for marijuana possession. And I think the total number of people going backwards that people estimate that's going to impact is about 6,500 people. It's a very small number. So marijuana possession is, the criminalization of marijuana possession, I think the most important thing about that is that it leads to a lot of interaction, hostile interaction between police and people in public. Those people don't end up in jail or prison for a long time. In Ohio, simple marijuana possession is a citation-only offense. You can't even arrest somebody for it. In other states, of course, it's lawful in many other states. But Ohio police are constant. It's routinely the case that they're searching people's cars, they're searching people because they're smelling marijuana. It's one of the most common ways that they are end up doing searches and that sort of thing. So it's an important issue, but it's not a huge driver of the mass incarceration phenomenon. Yes.
Do you think that there is a larger shift in education and how law is being taught that is leading towards this shift in how law is being practiced?
That's a good question. I mean, I hope so. The total incarcerated population in the United States has started going down a little bit in the last 5 or so years. It peaked at about 2.1 million people in state and federal prisons and jails, and now I think it's down to maybe 1.9, so it hasn't gone down dramatically. It's still vastly above, most other all other developed countries. So maybe, and there are these kind of incremental things. The First Step Act that was passed under the Trump administration was a good first step. It reduced some penalties, but it was not a huge effect. Biden's recent announcement is another small step. So I guess, it feels like there's a lot of public awareness of this issue now that there wasn't, 20 years ago. We haven't seen a significant drop, a significant change in how our policy actually works yet, though. So some mild changes around the edges, but nothing really significant yet. What kind of corporations employ prisoners? I'm not sure. Like I said, it's a fairly small number. So I'd have to do more research to figure out what exactly are those businesses. I'm not sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, great question. So in the first film, the one gentleman, Norris Henderson, asked the question, right, why do we send people here? So what are we trying to accomplish by sending people to prison? And certainly the answer to that, as you can see from how we behave, how we do things over the last, 40, 50 years in the United States, is punishment, right? Prison conditions are unpleasant, often really miserable, but at the very best, extremely unpleasant. Bad food, bad, overcrowded. Even in the best scenarios, the Cuyahoga County Jail got a lot of attention over the last couple of years for just horrible conditions. A lot of suicides in the jail. So there of course are very different ways to do this, and a common model that gets looked at is the Nordic model, the Northern European countries. And you asked about pilot programs. I just read about the state of Pennsylvania, who has, there've been, this is incarceration is primarily at the state level. There's some significant federal incarceration, but a lot of it's in the state of Ohio, state of Pennsylvania, what have you. And, state officials traveling to the Nordic countries, visiting those prisons, trying to think about what that model looks like and would it lead to better outcomes here. And Pennsylvania is actually doing a pilot project where they are building a facility that looks like a Nordic prison. It kind of looks like when you go to IKEA and like wander around and see the nice little, bedrooms or whatever, like that's what the jail cell, it looks like an apartment, a decent apartment, just a kind of completely different model for how we want to approach this. The American model is always punitive, always thinking about, we've got to make sure the prisoners don't have this or don't have that or don't have that. They might do something bad with it. They might get away with something. And, that is just fundamentally the opposite mindset of the other model, right? Of instead saying, well, you're here for a period of time. That is a punishment, and a severe punishment, to be removed from your family and your work and your community or whatever. But while we've got you here, are we going to try to treat you in a way that makes you feel like you become a better person, or treat you in such a way that you become a worse person? And we have been doing definitely the latter. And there's a lot of research showing that our prisons and our jails are very criminogenic. They increase the likelihood that people will reoffend once they are released, as opposed to the idea hoping to decrease that effect. So, again, baby steps in the United States. We still have a very punitive, harsh mindset. But I do see a few, I guess you can just, look at the track record and say, there are so many countries around the world that have dramatically lower levels of violent crime and incarcerate dramatically fewer people. Why are we stuck in the other box where we have more violent crime and so much more? What can we try something different that might lead to some different outcome? So one pilot project that I think is encouraging. Yeah.
Something, I don't need it, you're really sweet, I'll talk loud. If anyone remembers the documentary Knife Skills, it's Edwins and Shaker.
Yeah.
Remember?
Yes, Edwin's, right. Fabulous.
Brandon, we adore that guy and what he's doing, and I learned something that because he hires incarcerated
Correct.
people, that usually the return rate in the prisons is 96%. But when you go through Edwin's programs, the return rate to prison is 4%.
So
There's a pilot program right there in itself.
absolutely.
And it works.
Correct. So I was just at Edwin's a week or two ago and had a fabulous meal. And again, the brilliant kind of approach there is to take a population that, has very little to try to hope for or opportunity, right? Another thing we do is we impose a tremendous amount of collateral consequences. This got extremely popular in the 80s and 90s, where you have a certain conviction, now you can't get a license to be a barber, you can't do this, you can't do that, just on and on and on. And so Edwin's, the way they treat their, the people who work there, I think goes beyond just giving them opportunities, training them in skills, but rather imbuing them with a sense of value. And I can do things that are, really remarkable. And, I took some friends there who were visiting from out of town, some law professors, and she said, well, I've been to reentry, we'd call it reentry, right? Reentry projects where people are like, making deli sandwiches or whatever, and that's great. But Edwin's is a reentry project where they're making like really excellent, like fine cuisine, and they're exactly, and there's a level of kind of dignity and pride in that work that is really totally different than how we usually approach that. I think it's a really awesome example. Absolutely. Yes.
So, and this is a question for you. So with
Yeah, great. So, I mean, I hope that we're having a positive impact on our students, but the biggest thing that I would say is, 10 or 12 years ago, a few students cared about these issues, but it wasn't broad, it wasn't a lot of students coming in who already had this awareness. And these days, this is like the thing that so many of our students are passionate about. They're people will come in halfway through their career in some completely unrelated field and say, I decided to go to law school because of the George Floyd protests or because of, and I'm thinking about mass incarceration and the racial inequalities in that system and right and how to find, how to combat that and try to come up with solutions. And so many of our students, that's what's driving them to come to us at the law school. So that's extremely encouraging to me, right? That the students have that already and they're passionate about it. And then of course in the law school, we try to equip them with tools to really make a difference and see what's really going on and how the systems actually work and to envision that it can be different, right? It doesn't have to be this way. It can be different. So hopefully that will come. But I think I'm encouraged by the attitudes and energy that our students have. Absolutely.
If I could piggyback off of that, I take a class. I'm a freshman at Kent State, and I took a class, or I'm taking a class called Issues in Law and Society that teaches the issues within like prisons and society and our law system. Do you think a class like that and studying like that and understanding those issues would make that a better way for students to learn and be more aware of what's going on in these systems?
Yes, definitely. And I think that a lot of, our law school, a lot of schools are absolutely doing that and doing it a lot more than we used to, of thinking not just approaching law from saying, okay, here's what the doctrine is and here's how you behave when you're in a courtroom and, whatever, but trying to think more deeply about the social setting and the factors that are driving these. And there's a big disconnect between what the law sometimes says. You have a right to, a preliminary hearing in Cuyahoga County under the Ohio Constitution, but as actually practiced, everybody waives their preliminary hearing. Well, why do they do that? Because the prosecutor, if they get an indictment returned before the preliminary hearing happens, then you don't have the preliminary hearing. And so the only effect of insisting on your preliminary hearing is that the prosecutor will get you indicted more quickly so that they don't have to have the preliminary hearing. So you can teach in theory, the Ohio Constitution guarantees us all right to a preliminary hearing, which is a public hearing. You're represented by counsel. You get to cross-examine the government's witness and see if they have probable cause. But in reality, those almost never happen. They just don't, right? So that's something that we definitely try to bridge that gap. And I think students really, they find that very valuable for sure.
What about fines and parole fees? Where they don't have the ability to dig their way out or
Yeah, the problem of fines and costs and things. Yeah, the problem of fines and costs is a huge one, and it was touched on in a number of the areas there. And so, one of the big problems is, as I said, these systems are very expensive. The jails and the imprisonment is a very expensive way to try to address these problems. And partly because of that, there's a pressure to try to extract money out of the people in the system. It doesn't fully fund any of this, but to partly fund some of that. That leads to a very dysfunctional dynamic where you're trying to extract money out of people who have little or no resources, and it simply leads to a spiral of now they can't pay their fee, now they get additional fees, now they lose their driver's license, now they're driving to work and they get another driving under suspension because they can't pay the fees to get their license reinstated. So anytime, this is a problem with local municipal courts who fund a lot of their budget by the kind of fees that people pay as part of their conviction, and it creates a real incentive for the courts to make sure they're getting those fees. And so that's, it's a very serious problem.
yeah, counterproductive.
It's counterproductive, absolutely. Yes, I think that's a great comment. I mean, uh, I think some people fear that, some of these social programs and rehabilitation programs and reentry programs, they don't work all the time. And it's true, they don't work all the time. But the relevant comparison is compared to what, right? Compared to what else we're spending. And so to, the such a huge budget that we're spending. I mean, I heard the director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, and I forget the figure, but when he started, he's been doing that for maybe 40 years. And when he started, his budget was, tiny, and he had very few prisoners. And I think his budget has grown 10 times or more over his tenure, because now we're spending huge amounts of money on that prison system. And that's a lot of money that, could be redirected. In particular, the parole story. And of course, as the film points out, there is never a compensation on the other side, right? That loss of life is forever. But it's also the case that keeping that man in prison for the rest of his life also does not compensate the victims, right? The loss is still there. And the idea of keeping people in life without parole, kind of sentences, those are individuals. One of the huge costs of our prison system now is we have a lot of elderly people in the prison system, and those people are very expensive to provide medical care, right? It's so much more expensive to provide medical care in a prison than outside of a prison, even though the public is still paying for it. Someone who's released when they're 70 years old is not going to be able to pay for their own, but it's still so much less expensive than the medical care being provided in the prison. And so, there was a recent kind of natural experiment you may have heard in the news. Like during COVID, we did release a number from federal prison of elderly and kind of high-risk prisoners who were maybe late in their sentence or whatever, and we released about 11,000 prisoners as part of that program over a couple years there. And since then, a report just came out that of those 11,000 who were released, 17 of them have been rearrested. 17 out of 11,000. I mean, that's an astonishingly low rate. That's not the standard recidivism rate for prisoners generally, but when you think about, the violent crime, by age, young men, and then it just drops off, right? And so by the time this guy's in his 30s or 40s or 50s, like, there's, extremely low risk at that point. And to continue holding people for another 20, 30, 40 years, it's really a brutal way to approach it.
I wanted to share one thing. I worked with several prisons here in California and Arizona, and one of the things that people are still stuck on is the word rehabilitation. They got to get rid of that word. It's the word habilitation that needs to be the standard. How are you going to habilitate people to a new way of thinking, to a new way of operating the prisons? You're going to rehabilitate, get people back to the way they were before they got into prison. That's not necessarily the answer.
It's not the right direction, right?
But, with Edwin's program or others around the country, the habilitation model is one that is showing a lot more effect.
That's a great comment, right? And I mean, the other comment, while we do hold a lot of people for a long time, most prisoners, 95% plus, are going to be released at some point in their life, right? They will eventually be released, almost all of them. Not all, but almost all of them. And so then the question is, what are they going to be like after they've released? What have we done with them to try to, like you said, habilitate them, get them to a place in their life and their, that they can live a reasonable life and not be reoffending? Yeah.
So, taking it back to the film, the young man who's not so young anymore spent 25 years in prison when he was, probably about 15 or so when he went?
Yeah, maybe 17, I think. Yep.
17
Yep.
when he went. And hopefully you have an answer, and I hope this is not out of the scope of, because I know we're getting to the point to where prison, the time, and then rehab or habilitation, as the man before me just spoke and said. Is there any plan or anything that you know of before we get to this point of someone going to prison? Are there any investments? Are there any programs other than just people going to school,
Right.
what's going on with kids. Grandparents don't know how to operate phones, so the kids are doing whatever and learning these things from YouTube, right, or
Yeah.
wherever else they're learning from. Um, and then 10 years old, and it's just an example. I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a, so, and I just want to use this as an example. I just did a project. We were in Minnesota where there's like a 10 or 11-year-old kid at 2 in the morning still in the cars, being raised by, grandparents or what have you. So how do we help them? How does the community, how does the government, whoever is creating these programs for rehab, let's educate them so they don't get there.
Yeah, no, I mean, so you're right. I don't have the answer to that, but you're absolutely right, right? That we want to look earlier and deeper and prevent these things from happening altogether in the first place. I've got to wrap it up. I've got to hit the road, but just to end on a positive note, I don't know if people are always aware of this or not, but in the second movie, they talked about how violent crime in the 90s in New York City and across the country was really high, and it really was. It was terrible. And I think the statistic was in New York City in 1990, the year of that shooting, there were 2,400 or 2,600 homicides that year. So last year in New York City, there were 485 homicides. So we've seen a massive drop in violent crime over the last 30 years in the United States. And that's true in Ohio, it's true in New York City, it's true all over the country. And it's mysterious. There's no easy answer to why that happened, and I don't know, right? But the idea of what we want is less violent crime in the first place, right? We have seen dramatic decreases in violent crime over the last 30 years. So that's something to be happy about and continue to try to really work on. Yeah.
That doesn't make the front page of the newspapers, though.
Yeah, right. I know. It's just the new crime that makes the front page of the newspaper. That's correct. But really, it's an extremely positive trend. And just imagine, 2,000 lives in New York that last year were not lost because that rate is so much lower than it was 30 years ago. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation so much. Glad you could all be here.